Now, don't get me wrong, the Boxster is brilliant and having a Porsche in the garage is a real privilege. But it's not all shiny paintwork, cornering on rails and epic road trips. Owning a 10-year-old sports car is much the same as owning a 10-year-old car. Stuff wears out and things start to break, as I know all too well. Welcome to Project 981 and welcome back to the channel. And yes, there are some bits broken on the Boxster. Now, one of the reasons I started Project 981 and this channel was to try and capture my journey, the ownership journey of a sports car on YouTube. And sports car ownership on YouTube is generally a happy place. The paint is always shiny, the road trips are always epic, and performance is always brisk. But, well, if you own a car, you'll know as well as I do that 10 years of wear and tear does produce wear and tear, and things do break. And in the case of the Boxster, here we are, summer 2025, a couple of things have cropped up that I wasn't really hoping I'd see for a while. One small thing, easily enough solved, one kind of medium-ish one, and a bit of a biggie, kind of well known too. So all in all, not brilliant. Anyway, let me take you through them, because if you're a regular viewer, you'll know I try and convey ownership in an open and transparent way. I'm going to show you what's broken. I'm going to discuss what I think I might be able to do about it, and I'd welcome your thoughts and comments in the comments as we go on. Right, let's start with the small thing. So first things first, and this one is relatively easy to manage. Now, I've taken off the sill on my car principally to remove the drain plugs which affect the way the roof drains, yada yada yada. But holding the sill along the base of here is 8 separate little plug grippy fastener things, and I'll show you a shot of that now. There's 2 here, the 2 at the front, they've gone back in, fallen out. I spotted them by some miracle, managed to find them, put them back in, they've fallen out again. And I think the problem isn't just the clip, it's the housing. So 2 new housings, they need to go in here, and the body, which is to say the female part of the housing, I don't think I can force through because of the shape of it. So the sill needs to come off again, pop the old ones out, put the new housings in, the new clips in. It's probably an hour's work. Bit of a nuisance, but I like to do things properly, and that really is quite quick and easy, and these are cheap as chips. So that is fine, not a problem, happy to resolve that. So next up is steering, and I'm going to drop in now a photo of my wonky wheel. Okay, so wonky wheel is not in itself a problem. I could have just parked it on the piss, to be honest, but the reality is, in a straight line, flat road, middle of the crown, it's definitely pulling to the left, which means I'm having to constantly hold the wheel just right of centre, which isn't great for, well, it's not great for driver comfort, and it does tell me that the suspension geometry is now in need of some attention. And that's, well, that's resolvable, but it brings with it a memory of a comment from last year when the car was MOT that one of the rear lower control arms, I think that's the coffin arm, colloquially known as the coffin arm, has already started to wear out too. Those have a big fat rubber bushing which attach to the chassis, and they are well known for wearing out. And if your lower control arm goes, well, the control of your rear wheels starts to wander. And if you're going to change your geo setting, which is to say try and get the car straight and level, and you have a wonky piece at the back, do you then change the wonky piece at the back in order to get the geo sorted? So it's not just a question of getting the car on the ramp and having the suspension aligned. I now think about whether I replace the coffin arm, and if one coffin arm is gone, there's a good chance, to the theme of wear and tear, that the other one's gone. So we're into the diminishing returns or escalating expense of ownership. Do I then replace 2 lower coffin arms, lower control arms, on the basis that they're both going to go, one already is on its way, in order to make my steering straight? And it's double because the third problem, the biggie, will also require probably some attention to the suspension geometry. Okay, let's have a look at that, shall we? Now, before the big reveal, a little bit of context. 981 generation Boxster and Cayman came in a variety of flavours, principally base, S, GTS, my car is GTS, and then GT4 for the Cayman and Spider for the Boxster. And for the purposes of this video, what you need to know is that any car that came with Sports Chrono, which can be spotted by the clock on the dashboard and additional buttons in your center console, do check out my buttons video if you haven't figured out how they all work yet. Sports Chrono, and that did a whole variety of different things which I talk about in that video, but one of the things that it added to the car's spec was, I'm going to kind of give the game away now, Porsche's active drivetrain mounts. Essentially a very short version of the PASM damper in the engine mount, which allowed the mount to be softer and stiffer depending on a whole variety of dynamic physics inputs for acceleration, yaw, braking, all the usual bits and pieces. Now, Porsche got a lot of things right with the 981, but one of the things that it didn't get quite right was the way it manufactured the PADM, the Porsche Active Drivetrain mounts. And you could kind of classify that in the same vein as the PSE. Now, if you've been following my ownership journey, you'll know that the Porsche sports exhaust is also well known in the 981 generation for failing. The internal valve goes a bit kaput, the actuator goes a bit kaput, things generally don't work, and you have a broken sports exhaust, which, well, if you want to replace it, is quite costly. And, well, should we have a look at the dashboard? So here we are, Boxster GTS, which you're helpfully reminded of in the multifunction display MFD, or the computer, which is here. So you're minding your own business, you're going for a little drive, and then suddenly you get an error message which pops up. I'm going to recreate the magic moment for you by putting my key in, going to position 1, and lo and behold, there we go, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, I have got a failed active drivetrain mount. PADM disabled, service required, driving permitted. Okay, what on earth does that mean? Well, let's unpack that, shall we? Because it's not ideal. So PADM, what does that actually mean? Well, what it means is that one of the drivetrain mounts, there's actually 3, which is to say the engine is bolted into the chassis in 3 places, but 2 of those are these active drivetrain mounts, and they're kind of in there somewhere. I might be able to drop in a clip now to show you where they are in my car. But ostensibly they have the same technology that variable damping units have in suspension, which through the application of electrical current varies the thickness, the functional resistance of the fluid in the damper, which makes the damper variably softer and harder. And the theory is that when you go into sport mode, sport plus mode, the car senses dynamic driving and it'll firm up the mount so that the movement of the engine vis-a-vis the chassis in relation to the chassis is diminished, it's reduced to produce, as Porsche would probably describe it, improved driving excellence. Basically, it makes the car a little bit stiffer for more dynamic driving. The problem, it's well known, is that actually it's not so much the mount that fails, it doesn't physically break, the engine doesn't drop out of the chassis, but there's a tiny little sensor, a little movement sensor, sort of a type of strain gauge, I think, buried right inside the mount. It gets damaged, it gets water ingress, it shorts out, and if you diagnose the code, it effectively refers to an electrical short. So as far as the car's concerned, the mount's fine, but the electrical problem is manifest in the mount. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, first of all, it means that particular mount has stopped working. I haven't, despite my best efforts, managed to ascertain whether they failed to hard or soft. I'm kind of assuming, thinking how the technology works, that if you don't apply current, it fails safe, it applies, it fails to the soft mode. I think it requires the current to firm up the fluid, which has that fancy name which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. Anyway, I'm also assuming that Porsche are clever enough to know that if one has failed, that it will then, the car will deactivate the other. So I'm thinking, and if you know better, do jump in the comments, that at the moment, with one fail, the car has effectively disabled both active drivetrain mounts, that they have defaulted to soft, and no amount of pressing of Sport or Sport Plus will change that. So where does that leave me here and now with the car? Well, it's completely safe to drive. It literally says that driving is permitted, and people carry on driving in this state for, well, months, arguably even years, but certainly months and weeks is fine. However, I'm a chap that likes things to be right and proper, and although I love the idea of the drivetrain mounts, and Porsche has very cleverly integrated it into the Sports Chrono feature, the reality is, and this is why it's a biggie, that the parts alone, a replacement PADM, costs, now this is 2025, I'm going to quote in GB pounds, but it's roughly £1,000, £1,200, £1,300. You could probably just about find one for less if you hunted around. And that is just for one mount on its own, no labour, nothing else, a single mount. Now bear in mind that if one is gone, the other's going to go. Now I know from the service record of my car that one has already been replaced. So I'm on to my third effectively, and if I'm going to replace the broken one now, that's, let's say with labour, I'm looking at a minimum of 1,500 quid to replace something that probably shouldn't have broken in the first place. And crucially, this is where it gets interesting, you can't really tell it's broken. So let me talk about options for Cayman and Boxster owners. And earlier I was talking about Spider and GT4, and they have the same active drivetrain mount. So we've all got this potential problem looming if we've got these PADM mounts. Okay, what are the options? Well, most of your options require something going on at the back of the car, so I've moved around to the back of the GTS to talk about them. Okay, first things first, if you have a Boxster or a Cayman, Spider or GT4, and you still have the extended OPC, which is to say Porsche warranty, you're sitting pretty. You may even be sitting pretty if you have an aftermarket warranty. Book it in, get it replaced, it's covered. Okay, that's straightforward, isn't it? And as I say, with the possible exception of the small print on your extended warranty, generally speaking, in the UK at least, this problem is one that will be dealt with by your Porsche centre. Book it in, don't worry about it. However, if, like me, you have a slightly leggy, although that has no bearing on it, Porsche GTS, and you don't have any extended warranty, then you've got to think a little bit more smartly. I wasn't budgeting for the 12 with labour 1,500 quid to replace one mount on one side of my car. And the reality for me is, as I mentioned a moment ago, I don't really notice a difference. I don't tend to track my car, I don't really drive it at those excessive speeds, G lateral acceleration, where the mount train performance, the drivetrain mounts performance makes a big difference. So I'm not really missing anything. Okay, so what are the options in that case? Well, don't forget that a lot of Boxsters and Caymans don't have PADM, they just have passive engine mounts, and well, it's tempting, isn't it? So the price for one of those, again, yeah, your mileage may vary, no pun intended, but around 250, 300 quid, possibly with some VAT and some labour, and that gets you home and dry. But you wouldn't just replace one, of course, because you don't want to have two different types of mounts, so you'd replace two. But even at that price point, replacing two with some labour is going to be still about half the cost of doing one active mount. So that's very tempting, and I think that's the route I'm erring towards. But it brings with it the complication of having the error message still on the dash. So there's a school of thought which says you can code out, effectively tell the car that it no longer has active drivetrain mounts, and to therefore not worry about the fact that it can't see them. I've done a little bit of hunting, can't find examples of that being done, but it's generally believed to be possible, so that could be a conversation with my local garage. I've also found, I think they're based in New Zealand, that's a red herring possibly, but there is a chap who's figured out a way to actually replace the sensor, the failed sensor in the mount. So the mount itself, the body, as I said a moment ago, all perfectly fine. It's probably the tiny little sensor, the strain sensor, the accelerometer, whatever it is, that fails. And I'll pop a link in the description. There's a chap who's figured out a way to replace that, which requires taking the mount out, doing a bit of grinding, taking the old one out, putting the new one in, putting it back in again. No worries with coding, because you're basically putting a new version back in and it's all fine. It's quite pricey. As I said, I'm not that fussed about the performance, so anyway, it's an option by all accounts. And the last thing to do, well, the last thing is just leave it. I'm not, as I say, terribly wild about that, but it is perfectly possible. And actually, for the purposes of budgeting, it might be something I do, sit on it for a couple of months as I work out how to pay for it. However, now, back to the back of the car, because to get to the mounts requires removing some of the stiffening plates and members and bits and pieces under here. And one of the other projects that I've been planning to do on the GTS, probably next year, per my original timetable, was to add some of these stiffeners, the chassis stiffeners that feature on the 718, so the newer version, 982 if you will, of the Boxster and Cayman. And again, shout out to Baz at TestDriveScotland, because it's his video that gave me the idea for that, and there's various bits we can bolt on. And simultaneously, it seems sensible, if you're going to get under there and get the car on a ramp, to maybe look at the X73, the solid anti-roll bar, some fresh drop links, and so on. And you can see how quite quickly we are into escalating costs once again. However, my theory here is that the passive damper is a little bit more compliant, which is to say it reduces NVH, noise, vibration, harshness, more than the active mount would do when stiff. And I like to use my car in GT mode, as regular viewers will know, so I'm not too fussed about having a nominally softer mount. The good thing about the 718 stiffeners, they add a little bit of, they actually add mechanical stiffness, which is transmitted into the car, or which we perceive then as a slightly stiffer rear end. Now, we're not changing the stiffness of the engine mounts, of course, but we are tightening up the back end vis-a-vis suspension and driving dynamics. And this is where we get into this loop, because I've just said suspension, and if you drop all those bits to change the mounts, I think the consensus is you then need to do the rear geo, because it might have changed the alignment of the suspension mounts. So if I'm going to add roll bars, stiffeners and change the mounts, I need to do the rear suspension geo, which brings us back to the lower control arms, which brings us back to the steering wheel. So I've got some big decisions coming up. Do I spend, probably getting on for £1,500, £2,000 on all that work, all the bits and pieces? I don't have the ability to do it myself, sadly, to get what should be a slightly improved NVH and chassis stiffness and handling set up for the car? Or do I sit tight, just swap out the standard PADMs, the broken one and its sibling, with some passive dampers, and not do anything more for the moment? Or what? I don't know. I've got a preference, which is to just do it all in one go when the car's on the ramp, but I'd love to hear your ideas too. So do drop those in the comments, and I'll be looking forward to reading those as we go on. So options, and I guess I should be grateful that I do at least have some options about replacing the drivetrain mounts. Something bigger, engine related, dare I say, might produce fewer options and bigger bills. But anyway, there we go. Now, if you've experienced the same problem with the drivetrain mounts on your 981, do jump in the comments and let me know how you resolved it. I'd love to hear from different owners of their own experiences, as much as it's a bitter and frustrating experience to have. If you'd like to know how I get on with this, do consider subscribing to the channel. But otherwise, as always, thank you for watching this video. Thank you for supporting Project 981, and I'll see you for the next one.